The Catherine shipyards had been on fire for 38 minutes when the evacuation alarm finally gave up pretending it was optional. Every soul on the platform was running. The Vreth cargo loaders abandoned their stations without a second thought, their forearms pumping as they thundered down the evacuation ramps in organized, efficient terror. The Catherine engineers, beings who had spent decades studying emergency protocols, were already gone, their emergency beacons blinking steadily on the way to the muster point. Even the dock supervisor, a grizzled old Mendari who claimed to have survived 3 separate hull breaches, had not hesitated for a single moment before joining the exodus. Running was the right thing to do. Running was the smart thing to do. Marcus Reyes was running too, and he was a third-class mechanic. The labor registry made sure he never forgot the classification. A compact human from Varo Station with scarred hands, duct-taped boots, and 11 years of experience fixing things that other species had already written off as dead. He knew the shipyard's layout better than most. He knew exactly how fast a fuel depot fire could travel through a pressurized corridor. He knew, with the practical certainty of a man who had spent his entire career reading the moods of machines, that Level 7 had maybe 4 minutes before the secondary tanks blew and took half the platform with them. His legs knew all of this. His legs were fully committed to the exit ramp. Then he heard it. It was buried under the roar of the fire and the groaning of stressed metal and the fading thunder of boots on grating. Thin, a high, rhythmic, and unmistakably desperate. Not an alarm, not a mechanical sound. Something that came from a throat, from lungs, from a living creature that was small and frightened and had no idea that everyone had already left. Marcus slowed. He stopped. He stood alone in the smoke-filled corridor while the heat pushed against EEA. The corridor on Level 6 was a different world entirely. The air had turned solid, thick, gray, and bitter with the smell of burning fuel and melted composite plating. Every breath Marcus pulled through his jacket tasted like the inside of an engine that had given up. His eyes streamed the moment he crossed the threshold, the smoke finding them with immediate, personal hostility. The emergency lighting had failed on this level, reduced to a single strip of red warning light at the far end of the corridor that pulsed weakly through the haze like a dying heartbeat. The heat was extraordinary. It wasn't the aggressive, obvious heat of open flame. It was the ambient heat of a space that had been cooking for a long time, the kind that soaked into clothing and skin and settled in the joints of a man's hands and told him that with quiet medical authority, that continued presence here was a profoundly poor decision. Every surface Marcus touched as he moved along the wall radiated it back at him. The metal grating beneath his boots ticked and popped. The ceiling groaned somewhere ahead with the slow, exhausted sound of a structure renegotiating its relationship with gravity. He dropped to his knees where the smoke was thinnest. Crawling was better. 6 inches off the floor, the air was almost breathable, carrying just enough oxygen to keep his vision from graying at the edges. He moved forward on his hands and knees, with his jacket pressed flat against his mouth and nose, navigating by the red pulse of the emergency strip and the sound, always the sound, threading through the chaos like a wire he was following hand over hand. It led him around a collapsed section of ceiling, past an overturned equipment cart, through a doorway whose frame had warped just enough to let him through on his stomach, and then his hand came down on something that was not metal. It was warm. Warmer than the floor. Warmer than the walls. A different kind of warmth entirely. He didn't have a light, but the red pulse from the corridor gave him just enough to see by. What Marcus found curled against the base of an overturned cargo container was nothing his 11 years in the shipyards had prepared him for. He had fixed engines from 40 different species. He had handled biological cargo manifests that listed creatures he couldn't pronounce. He had worked alongside beings of every conceivable shape and temperament across 3 star systems. He had never seen anything like this. The hatchling was barely larger than a house cat. its body compact and instinctively folded into the tightest possible configuration. The posture of a creature that had decided if it made itself small enough, the terrible world around it might simply fail to notice it existed. Its scales were the deep blue-black of a night sky in the hour before dawn, and even through the smoke and the dim red light they carried a faint inner shimmer, like starlight trapped just beneath the surface and trying to find its way out. 4 small limbs were pressed flat against its body. 2 wings, delicate, veined, heartbreakingly small, were folded so tightly they had nearly disappeared against its sides. Its tail was wrapped around itself twice, the tip tucked under its chin like a creature that had used every available piece of itself to build whatever comfort it could find. Its whole body shook with each breath. Not shivering, not the mechanical response of a cold creature seeking warmth. This was the deep, exhausted shaking of something that had been sobbing for a long time. Great, desperate. The silent sobs that moved through its entire frame, from the tip of its wrapped tail to the ridge of its small, smoke-streaked nose. Tears tracked down its face and hit the hot metal floor with the faintest hiss of steam. Marcus looked at it for exactly 2 seconds. In those 2 seconds, he took in the situation with the same complete, uncluttered attention he brought to Evie. The building was coming apart around him, and Marcus Reyes ran like the fire was making a personal point. The corridor on level 5 had already begun its slow structural confession, walls bowing inward at the joints, floor grating lifting at the edges where the supports beneath had softened in the heat, every surface communicating in the universal language of stressed metal that the time for being inside this space had conclusively passed. The emergency lighting was completely gone here, replaced by the orange pulse of the fire itself bleeding through cracks in the walls, painting everything in the shifting, unreliable color of something about to become much worse. Marcus knew this corridor. He had walked it 1,000 times carrying toolboxes and parts manifests and lukewarm coffee in a thermos that never quite sealed properly. And he knew where it turned, where it narrowed, where the overhead pipe housing jutted down low enough to catch a tall person across the forehead if they weren't paying attention. He ran it from memory with his eyes half shut against the smoke, and the hatchling pressed flat and firm against his chest with both arms locked around it. He could feel it against him, still trembling, but differently now. Not the deep, exhausted, sobbing tremor from before. This was the tight, electric trembling of a creature that understood on some fundamental biological level that speed was currently the correct response to the situation and was communicating its full agreement with Marcus's chosen strategy. He took the turn at the level 5 junction without slowing. Behind him, with a sound like a large and very final decision, the ceiling gave. And not all of it. A single beam, a main support strut by the sound of it, something that had been holding up a significant portion of the platform's midsection, came down in a controlled and catastrophic arc and hit the grating exactly 3 feet behind Marcus's heels. The impact traveled up through The emergency shuttle was loud with voices and movement, and the organized chaos of a rescue team doing its job. Nobody quite knew what to do with Marcus Reyes. He had come out of the burning corridor like something the fire had reluctantly returned, soot blackened from his hairline to his boot soles, eyes red and streaming, moving with the slightly mechanical determination of a man running entirely on the last reserves of something that wasn't quite adrenaline anymore. The response team medic had reached him first, grabbed his arm, steered him toward the nearest seat with practiced efficiency, and pressed an oxygen mask toward his face. Marcus had looked at it, then looked down at the bundle against his chest, then looked back at the medic. "Bring another one," he said. His voice came out rougher than he expected, scraped raw by smoke and heat. The medic stared at him. "Sir, you need to—" "Bring another one first," Marcus said. Not loudly, not aggressively, with the same quiet, immovable certainty he used when he told junior mechanics that a component needed replacing before the engine went back online. the tone of a man who had already finished the argument in his head and was simply waiting for the world to catch up. The medic brought another mask. Only then did Marcus sit. Not in the seat, but on the floor of the shuttle, back against the wall, knees up, the hatchling still held against his chest. He fitted the smaller mask as carefully as he could around the hatchling's smoke-streaked face, then put his own on, and for a long moment he just breathed and let the oxygen do its quiet, important work. Somewhere above him, the response team moved and spoke and managed the crisis. Marcus stayed on the floor. The hatchling had stopped shaking. It happened gradually, the fine, exhausted trembling that had moved through its whole body slowly releasing, degree by degree, like tension leaving a cable that had been wound too tight for too long. The xenobiologist's name was Thesivari, and she had the particular expression of someone delivering news they hadn't been trained to deliver. She crouched across from Marcus on the shuttle floor with a datapad in her hands, and the careful posture of a being who had spent her career around dangerous creatures and had learned to move slowly and speak clearly in their presence. She was Catharin, tall, reptilian, professionally composed, and she was doing an admirable job of maintaining that composure, despite the fact that everything about the current situation fell several miles outside her standard operating parameters. She told him first about the species. The hatchling was a Drakoveth. Marcus had heard the name the way most people in the outer shipyards had heard it. Distantly, reverently. In the same category as things that were old and sovereign, and not to be interfered with under any circumstances. Thesivari confirmed this with the systematic thoroughness of someone reading from a document she wished was shorter. 17 legal frameworks, 4 separate compact treaties, an entire subcommittee of interspecies law dedicated exclusively to Drakoveth sovereign rights and the considerable consequences of violating them. Marcus listened to all of it with his eyes on the hatchling and his hand resting lightly on its folded wing. Then Thesivari said the word bonded, and something in Marcus's attention sharpened. "Say that again," he said. She said it again. "Explain what that means," he said. The Thesivari set her datapad down with the quiet deliberateness of someone choosing their words the way a person chooses their footing on uncertain ground. The Drakoveth, she told him, were empathic imprinters in the first weeks of life. Their neurology in the hatchling stage was extraordinarily receptive, designed by some deep evolutionary logic to identify and attach to a stable presence during the period when they were most vulnerable. When a hatchling, Thesivari was still talking when it happened. She had moved on to the secondary implications, legal ramifications, conclave notification protocols, the 17 frameworks, and what they required of anyone who had come into prolonged contact with a sovereign hatchling. And Marcus was listening with the patient, surface-level attention of a man whose deeper focus was somewhere else entirely. Her words reached him. He registered them. He filed them in the part of his mind that handled things requiring attention later, because the hatchling was waking up. It happened slowly, the way dawn happens, not a single moment, but a gradual accumulation of small changes. The rhythm of its breathing shifted, deepening slightly, losing the careful mechanical quality of sleep and becoming something more present. On the small muscles along its shoulders released a tension Marcus hadn't consciously noticed they were carrying. Its tail, still wrapped twice around itself, loosened one careful coil. And then, with the unhurried deliberateness of a creature that had decided the world was worth looking at again, it opened one eye. The eye was gold, not the flat, reflective gold of metal or paint. This was gold the way certain moments are gold, charged with something interior, lit from a source that had nothing to do with the shuttle's overhead lighting. The iris was vast, filling most of the visible eye, and the pupil at its center was a vertical ellipse of absolute black that contracted slightly as it adjusted to the light and then settled, steady and clear and impossibly present, directly on Marcus's face. It looked at him, not around him, Not past him, not at the general vicinity of him the way animals sometimes look at the humans holding them, at him, with a focus and a specificity that said plainly, I know exactly who you are. I know what you did. I have been aware of you this entire time. Marcus looked back. And something happened in his chest that the understanding would come later, as most important understandings do, not in the moment itself, but in the quieter space afterward, when the mind finally has room to turn things over and examine them properly. Thesivari would explain it to him 3 days later in a medical bay on Varo Station, in the careful, measured language of a scientist who had spent considerable time figuring out how to say something extraordinary in a way that didn't cause a person to reject it outright. She would tell him about Drakoveth empathic projection, the hatchling's ability, already present and already instinctive even at this age, to extend its emotional state outward to the being it had anchored itself to share what it carried, to redistribute the weight. She would tell him that what he had felt in that moment, the door swinging open, the fear dissolving, the sudden impossible quiet, was the hatchling giving him the only thing it currently had to give, its own hard-won calm, the calm it had found precisely because he was there. Marcus would sit with that information for a long time when he received it. He would turn it over with the same slow, thorough attention he gave to any complex system he was trying to understand, examining it from different angles, testing its weight, checking where it connected to everything else. He would think about what it meant that a creature who had every reason to be broken had instead chosen, in whatever way a hatchling chooses anything, to take the piece it had barely managed to find and simply hand it to him. He would understand it fully eventually, and it would not change a single thing about what came after. Yeah, but that was later. Right now, Marcus Reyes knew none of it. Right now, he was just a soot-covered mechanic sitting on the floor of an emergency shuttle with a midnight-scaled hatchling breathing against his chest and a feeling in him like a room he hadn't known existed suddenly full of light. He had no frame. Her official name, Indravosh, was something that translated into roughly the color of deep water before the storm, remembered. It was, by any measure, a beautiful name. The Drakoveth Conclave's linguistic representative had explained it to Marcus with considerable reverence. The layers of meaning embedded in each syllable, the way the original Dravosh carried overtones of both memory and anticipation, the tradition of naming hatchlings after natural phenomena that contained contradictions within themselves, darkness that preceded light, stillness that preceded violence, the specific blue-black of deep ocean water in the moment before weather arrived to change everything. Marcus had listened respectfully to all of this. Then he had looked at the hatchling and said, "Storm deep." And that was that. He was a practical man. He had a practical man's relationship with language. Words were tools, and the best tools were the ones that fit the hand and did the job without requiring extensive explanation. Storm deep fit. It captured something true about her without taking 9 syllables to do it. The conclave representative had looked pained, and Marcus had felt mildly bad about that, and then Storm Deep had made the low resonant sound she made when she approved of something, and the matter was settled. The first week she fit in his arms like something that had always belonged there. She was still small enough that he could carry her against one shoulder, her tail looped loosely around his forearm for balance, her head up and turning with bright, systematic curiosity toward everything the world presented for her consideration. Or she examined his toolbox with intense scientific interest. She followed him through the corridors of Varo Station with the focused, unhurried attention of someone conducting important research. She slept curled against his side in the narrow bunk of his station quarters, taking up approximately 40% more space than her size. The compensation package was, by any objective measure, extraordinary. The lead representative had laid it out with the methodical precision of someone who had negotiated sovereign treaties across 4 centuries and understood that the most effective offers were the ones that left no reasonable counter-argument standing. There was a financial component, a number that made the station administrator sitting in the corner of the room go very quiet in a way that suggested his entire concept of wealth was being restructured in real time. There were professional considerations, a master mechanic contract with the Drakoveth Conclave's own engineering division, the most coveted technical position in 3-star systems, with access to vessels and technology that no human had ever been permitted to touch. And there were legal assurances, full indemnification across all 17 frameworks, a formal letter of gratitude entered into the compact record, his name attached permanently to an act of interspecies service that would outlive him by centuries. It was, in every practical sense, everything. Marcus sat across the table from 3 of the most ancient and powerful beings in the known systems and listened to every word of it with the same complete, unhurried attention he gave to every complex problem he encountered. He didn't interrupt. He didn't react visibly to the numbers. He asked 2 clarifying questions about timeline and jurisdiction, received answers, and nodded slowly in the way he nodded when he had fully understood something and was now deciding what to do with the understanding. Then he turned away from the elders entirely. And he turned to Storm Deep, who was sitting beside his chair with her wings folded and her gold eyes moving between the representatives and Marcus with the alert, intelligent attention she brought to everything she deemed worth studying. Marcus looked at her for a moment. Then he said simply and directly the way he said everything. The 3 Drakoveth elders had not moved since Stormdeep climbed onto the table. This was notable because the elders were not beings accustomed to stillness born of surprise. They were ancient. The youngest of the 3 had been alive for 4 centuries, and it showed in the way they occupied space, with the settled, immovable quality of mountains that had long since finished deciding what shape they intended to be. They had walked into the negotiation room on Varro Station with the measured authority of those who had never once in their considerable lives entered a room that wasn't already theirs. And then Storm Deep had climbed onto the table. She had done it without drama or announcement, simply placed one forepaw on the edge, then another, and pulled herself up with the fluid, unhurried grace of a creature that had already decided the outcome and was merely performing the formality of arriving at it. She was nearly 2 years old now, larger than the elders had clearly expected, her midnight scales carrying their interior shimmer with a depth and richness that had been absent in the hatchling they remembered from the incident reports. She moved like something that knew its own weight and had made peace with it. She walked the length of the table. She stopped directly in front of Marcus. She sat, and then, holding the elder's gold gaze with her own, she spread her wings. Not fully, not the aggressive, territorial full extension of a threatened adult. Exactly 3 inches, a precise, deliberate, almost conversational gesture that required, Thessavari had once explained, a level of muscular control that most Drakoveth didn't develop until their 2nd decade. 3 inches said something specific in Dravosh body language that no amount of translation could entirely flatten into other words. It said, "I am not here by accident. I am not here by force. I am not here because someone brought me or placed me or failed to prevent me. I am here because." The elder's name, in Dravosh, contained multitudes. It had been alive for 7 centuries. It had negotiated the 3rd Compact Accord and outlasted 4 galactic administrations and watched species rise to prominence and quietly recede again with the patient, unsentimental attention of something that understood time differently than most beings were capable of. Its scales were the deep amber of fossilized light, the color things turned when they had been subjected to immense pressure for an immense duration and had come through it changed but unbroken. It had walked into this negotiation room expecting, in the way that ancient things expect outcomes, to leave with what it came for. It had not expected Marcus Reyes, and the room was still processing the question he had asked. "What do you want?" still sitting in the unprecedented silence of it, when the elder leaned forward slightly and spoke. "You went into the fire for her," it said. Its voice carried the particular quality of age, not frailty, nothing like frailty, but depth. The resonance of something that had been producing that frequency for so long, it had become effortless, like a canyon that has been shaped by water until the water moves through it perfectly and without resistance. It paused. "She was no one to you," it continued. "No kin, no contract, no debt requiring settlement." Another pause, weighted and deliberate. "Nothing bound you to her in any framework we recognize." The statement wasn't accusatory, it wasn't challenging. It was the careful and precise language of a being that had spent centuries ensuring it understood things completely before drawing conclusions, laying out the facts of the situation the way Marcus laid out components before a repair, each piece examined separately before the relationship between them was addressed. Marcus looked at the elder across the table. He thought about the corridor on level 6, the smoke and the heat and the sound threading through Aiba. The accord of mutual witness did not exist before that day. No framework had anticipated it. No legal scholar across any of the Compact's member species had drafted preliminary language for it, proposed it in committee, or included it in any theoretical discussion of interspecies relations. It existed in the same category as things that only become imaginable once they have already happened, solutions to problems that nobody knew needed solving until a grease-stained human mechanic from Vero Station turned to a dragon hatchling in the middle of a formal negotiation and asked her what she wanted. The drafting took 4 hours. It took that long not because the principles were complicated. The principles, once Stormdeep had delivered her answer and the room had finished absorbing the implications, were surprisingly straightforward. It took 4 hours because the legal architecture required to express those principles within the existing frameworks of both human colonial law and Drakoveth sovereign custom had to be built from scratch, in real time, by 3 ancient Drakoveth representatives and a station legal officer who kept pausing to quietly reassure himself that what he was writing was genuinely happening. 17 amendments were required to reconcile the jurisdictional conflicts. 100 clauses to cover the specific rights, responsibilities, and reciprocal obligations of a bonded pair existing simultaneously under 2 sovereign legal traditions that had never previously been asked to recognize the same relationship. Each clause was negotiated with the methodical care of beings who understood that the document they were creating would become precedent, that every word chosen today would be the foundation on which future cases were built for decades or centuries to come. Marcus read every clause. He asked questions about 11 of them. He requested modifications to 4. The elder who had spoken to him across the table, the 7C, growth for a Drakoveth was not a gradual thing. It came in surges, weeks of apparent stillness, followed by sudden, dramatic expansions that left the xenobiological consultants revising their projections with the increasingly resigned energy of people who had stopped expecting their models to be correct and had begun simply documenting what happened and trying to catch up. Stormdeep grew the way significant things grew. Not steadily, not predictably, but with the accumulated force of something that had been building pressure quietly and had finally decided the moment was right. By her 5th year, she had outgrown Marcus's station quarters, his corridor, and the docking bay they'd been generously allocated by a station administrator who was simultaneously awed by her and quietly desperate about the structural implications. And by her 8th year, she was the size of a mid-range personnel shuttle, and the midnight blue-black of her scales had deepened into something that didn't merely shimmer anymore, but actively played with light, bending it, holding it, releasing it in ways that made the station's optical sensors file confused and contradictory reports. Marcus kept pace the only way he knew how. He learned her, the way he had learned every complex system he'd ever worked on, Not from manuals, not from the Conclave's extensive biological documentation, but through contact, through attention, through the slow accumulation of hours spent with his hands on the mechanisms of her and his mind fully present to what they were telling him. He learned the specific resonance of her breathing when something was wrong before she showed any other sign of it. He learned the way her wing membrane carried tension differently on the left side than the right, a minor asymmetry in her growth pattern that the Conclave's own physicians had noted and filed and not particularly worried about. He learned the temperature gradient of her scales in different emotional states. The people who had known Marcus Reyes before the shipyard fire struggled, when asked, to put the difference into words. It wasn't something you could point to directly. He was the same height he had always been, the same scarred hands, the same duct-taped boots that he replaced with identical duct-taped boots every time the previous pair finally surrendered entirely. He still carried his wrench with the casual intimacy of someone who had long since stopped distinguishing between the tool and the hand holding it. He still spoke sparingly and listened completely and fixed things that other people had already written off as beyond fixing. He still preferred the company of engines to the company of most beings, though most beings had developed over the years, the distinct impression that this preference said more about engines than it did about Marcus. But there was something, a quality that people reached for different words to describe and never quite landed on the right ones. A stillness, maybe, or the particular way he walked into a room, not like someone arriving, but like someone who had been quietly present for some time and was only now making it official. The way his attention, when it landed on something, landed completely, without the fragmented defensive quality that most people's attention carried. The perpetual reservation of a small portion of consciousness for monitoring threats and calculating exits. Marcus had no exits reserved. He was simply present, fully and without qualification in whatever moment he was standing in, with whatever broken thing he was currently holding in his hands. The fire had not made him that way. The people who knew him well enough understood this. His sister on Varo Station, the 3 mechanics who had worked alongside him for a decade, the station administrator who had watched him from a distance for years before the shipyard incident and recognized something in him he couldn't name. They understood.